It was March 23rd, 1994, a cold Siberian night, quiet and uneventful. Aeroflot Flight 593 lifted off from Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport, heading toward Hong Kong. The passengers settled in, unaware that in less than 6 hours their names would become part of aviation history. Not for where they were going, but for how they would never arrive. The aircraft, an Airbus A310, was nearly full. 63 passengers, 12 crew members, businessmen, families, tourists, and among them, the pilot's children. Captain Yaroslav Kudrinsky, 39 years old, was an experienced pilot with over 8,000 hours of flight time. He had flown through storms, across continents, trusted by his crew and loved by his family. That day, he was not just a captain. He was also a proud father. His 15-year-old son Igor and 13-year-old daughter Yana were on board with him, traveling to Hong Kong for the first time. For the crew, this was a routine long-haul flight. The A310 was one of the most advanced aircraft in Aeroflot's fleet, equipped with an autopilot system so reliable that pilots joked it could fly the plane better than they could. The skies were calm, the engines hummed steadily, and the cockpit, like most long flights, was peaceful. No one could have imagined that the quiet hum of those engines would soon turn into a scream of chaos, or that a small, innocent gesture from a curious child would set off a chain of events that even the best pilots in the world could not stop. At 5:40 p.m. Moscow time, Flight 593 climbed to cruising altitude, 33,000 feet above the frozen mountains of southern Siberia. The crew relaxed, monitoring instruments, chatting softly. The captain's children sat in business class, excited and restless. Every few minutes, Igor glanced toward the cockpit door, hoping his father would invite him in. In those years before strict Post 9/11 regulations, cockpit visits were common, even charming. Passengers often came to see the pilots. Sometimes children were allowed to touch the controls, to pretend to fly under supervision. It was a sign of trust between the crew and the sky. Captain Kudrinsky wanted to give his son that moment, a memory, a glimpse of what his father did for a living. So, just after the plane crossed Novosibirsk, he called Igor to the cockpit. The boy entered wide-eyed, the glow of hundreds of buttons reflecting off the glass. He looked out at the horizon, a dark blue ocean of stars, the faint curve of the earth. Below, nothing but mountains and snow. Kudrinsky smiled. "Sit down, son," he said, motioning to the left-hand seat, the captain's seat. Igor hesitated. "Really? Go ahead. You're flying to Hong Kong tonight." The co-pilots laughed. The atmosphere was light, warm, almost playful. The autopilot handled everything: speed, altitude, navigation. The crew had done this countless times. What harm could it do to let the boy hold the controls for a few minutes? The captain leaned back, proud, while Igor wrapped his small hands around the yoke, the control column. It felt firm, heavy, alive. He turned it gently left, then right. The plane responded slightly, tilting a few degrees before the autopilot corrected itself. "See that?" his father said. "It's all automatic. Even if you try, it keeps us steady." They all smiled. Nobody realized that the system had just registered something different, something subtle but catastrophic. On the Airbus A310, if the pilot applies sustained manual pressure on the controls, the autopilot interprets it as a signal to disengage. Not all at once, but partially, only on the affected axis. Igor's hands had been on the control long enough for that to happen. The autopilot quietly disconnected the aileron control, the part that manages the plane's roll, but left the rest engaged. The crew did not notice. The instruments still showed autopilot on, but the plane was no longer flying itself. Over the next few minutes, the jet began to drift slowly to the right, so slightly that no one noticed. The stars outside shifted. The horizon tilted by 1 degree, then 2, then 5. The co-pilots laughed at something on the radio. The captain sipped coffee. Igor smiled, still holding the yoke gently. Then, the artificial horizon, a small blue and brown circle on the screen, began to tilt further. 10 degrees. 15, 20. The autopilot tried to correct the imbalance, but was locked out of the roll control. It compensated by adjusting pitch and thrust, the wrong reaction. The plane was still banking, still turning, and now the nose began to dip. Seconds passed before anyone realized. "Hey, what's going on?" one of the co-pilots said, frowning. The captain leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Give me control." But when he touched the yoke, it felt heavy, unresponsive. The plane had entered a gentle spiral, slow at first, but accelerating. The stars outside were moving now, circling the cockpit windows like a carousel. The altitude dropped, 32,000 feet, 31,000. In the cabin, passengers felt a faint pressure in their ears. Some glanced up puzzled. Others kept reading, unaware. Then the flight deck alarms came alive. "Bank angle! Bank angle!" A robotic voice cut through the air. The captain grabbed the yoke. The plane kept turning. "Autopilot off!" Kudrinsky shouted. He pulled hard left. The jet lurched, engines roaring, the nose dropping further. Outside, the frozen peaks of the Kuznetsk Alatow mountains waited, dark and silent. And somewhere in the cabin, a 13-year-old girl named Yana felt her stomach twist as the plane tilted harder, faster, toward the earth. The warning voice echoed through the cockpit. "Bank angle." Captain Kudrinsky's head snapped toward the instruments. The blue and brown horizon on the screen was spinning like a wheel. The Airbus was banking at nearly 40 degrees, far beyond safe limits. "Autopilot off," he barked again, slamming the switch. But it was already off, at least partially. The system had disengaged from roll control long ago, and now, with full manual control restored, the aircraft responded violently. The captain pulled left to level the wings, but the momentum was too strong. The A310 rolled past 45 degrees. In seconds, the gentle drift became a spiral. Altitude, 30,000 feet. Bank angle, 50 degrees. Vertical speed, 2,000 feet per minute down. "Igor, get out!" Kudrinsky shouted, his voice sharp now. The boy froze, eyes wide, unable to move. One of the co-pilots reached to unbuckle him, pulling him out of the seat. The captain gripped the controls with both hands, his jaw tight. The instruments blurred, numbers spinning faster than thought. "Leveling, leveling," he said through clenched teeth. But the plane didn't listen. The Airbus was in what pilots fear most, an incipient spiral dive. The more he pulled back, the tighter it turned. The wings groaned, the engines howled. Gravity pressed everyone into their seats as the aircraft's nose dipped toward the snow-covered mountains below. Alarm screamed, "Stall! Pull up! Terrain!" The co-pilot, Andrei Muraviv, grabbed his side of the yoke, trying to counter. Two men fought against hundreds of tons of metal and physics. The plane bucked, climbed slightly, then dropped again. Passengers in the cabin began to feel it. A strange weightlessness followed by crushing force. Drinks spilled, trays slid. A few gasped as the lights flickered. One flight attendant stumbled in the aisle, grabbing a seat for balance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she started, but the microphone crackled uselessly. In the cockpit, the altimeter spun downward. 25,000 feet. 20,000. The captain's breathing was ragged. "Pull up! Pull up!" he shouted, sweat dripping from his forehead. The G-forces pressed him against the seat as the plane tried to climb. For a moment, it seemed to work. The A310's wings bit the air, lifting slightly. The artificial horizon steadied. Kudrinsky felt hope surge. They might recover. "Okay, we're climbing," the co-pilot yelled. But the relief lasted only seconds. Without the autopilot managing pitch balance, their pull was too aggressive. The plane shot upward too fast. Speed dropped. Alarms changed tone. "Stall! Stall! Stall!" The nose pitched up sharply, engines roaring in protest. The lift vanished. And then, silence. For a heartbeat, the jet hung suspended in the thin Siberian air, like a bird pausing before its final fall. Then gravity reclaimed it. The A310 rolled over completely and plunged nose down. The horizon disappeared. All the crew could see was black earth and snow rushing upward. The captain's hands trembled on the yoke. His eyes darted across the instruments. Nothing made sense. "Throttle," he shouted. "Full power." The co-pilot pushed the levers forward. The engine screamed, but the altitude meter kept spinning. 15,000 feet, 10,000, 8,000. The plane was falling at nearly 300 meters per second. In the cabin, chaos erupted. Passengers screamed as gravity vanished again. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. A suitcase flew past, hitting the wall. Someone prayed aloud. Someone else clutched their child. The flight attendants held onto seat rails, tears streaming down their faces. At the back, Yana, the captain's 13-year-old daughter, sat frozen, gripping the armrest until her knuckles turned white. She didn't understand what was happening, only that the floor had disappeared beneath her and her father was somewhere ahead, shouting into a storm of alarms. In the cockpit, Muraviv's voice cracked. "We're inverted. We're upside down." Kudrinsky fought the controls with everything left in him. The altimeter showed 6,000 feet. "Roll! Roll!" he yelled. He slammed the rudder, trying to right the jet. Slowly, painfully, the wings began to level. For a split second, they were horizontal again. The engine strained. The nose lifted. 5,000 feet. But momentum was merciless. The aircraft was too low, too fast, too heavy. Outside, the snow-covered ridges of the Kuznetsk Alatau mountains rushed closer, white streaks against the dark. The captain's voice was calm now, a whisper swallowed by the roar. "Hold on." At 5:59 p.m., Aeroflot Flight 593 disappeared from radar. Impact speed, 470 miles per hour. Location, a remote slope near Mezdyurchinsk, southern Siberia. All 75 people on board were killed instantly. There were no survivors. No mayday call, just a sudden silence in the sky. For days, no one knew what had happened. The weather was clear, the plane modern, the crew experienced. When rescuers reached the crash site, they found wreckage scattered across a frozen valley. Metal twisted like paper, blackened snow, personal belongings half buried in ash. Among the debris were the remains of 2 children. Investigators recovered the flight recorders, the black boxes, and what they heard would haunt them forever. On the tape, they could hear laughter, then confusion, then panic, and finally, the captain's last words. "Hold on." The morning after the crash, a helicopter hovered over the frozen ridges of the Kuznetsk Alatau Mountains. Below, smoke still curled from the snow, rising from a valley where metal lay scattered like confetti. From above, it looked less like a crash site and more like a wound, black and gray against a white landscape. Rescue teams landed at dawn. The cold was brutal, slicing through their gloves, freezing breath midair. There were no survivors to help, no voices calling for aid. Only silence, and the sound of crunching snow as men in orange suits began to search. They found fragments first, a child's shoe, a torn page from a magazine, a doll without its head. Then, pieces of the aircraft's fuselage, bent at impossible angles. One rescuer stopped, his eyes fixed on something half-buried, a small metal box, charred but intact. The flight recorder, the first of 2. "Black box located," he said into the radio, his voice trembling despite the cold. Back in Moscow, news spread fast. Aeroflot officials gathered behind closed doors. Publicly, they said only that Flight 593 had crashed under unknown circumstances. The A310 was one of their newest aircraft, a symbol of modernization. The suggestion that it had simply fallen from the sky was unthinkable. Investigators from Russia's Interstate Aviation Committee, MAK, arrived within hours. They were joined by experts from France, representing Airbus, the plane's manufacturer. The recorders were rushed to a laboratory in Moscow. Inside the lab, as technicians brushed soot from the black boxes, one of them muttered, "We'll know soon enough what happened up there." When they played the cockpit voice recorder, the first minutes were ordinary. The steady hum of engines, the rhythmic clicks of switches, the calm voices of professionals. Then laughter, a child's laughter. The room went still. The technicians exchanged glances. One reached for the volume knob, turning it higher. The voices were clear. Captain Kudrinsky, his son Igor, the co-pilot, and laughter echoing across the cockpit. Then came the words that changed everything. "Go ahead, son, try it." For the next minute, the recording captured light conversation. Igor asking questions, the pilots chuckling. Then the first anomaly appeared. A faint warning tone, easily ignored amid the chatter. Moments later, another. "Bank angle," said the synthetic voice. The tone of the cockpit changed. Confusion replaced laughter. The co-pilots began shouting. The captain's voice grew sharp, commanding. Alarm screamed, and then silence. The recording ended abruptly, a flat, lifeless tone marking the moment of impact. In the control room, no one spoke. One investigator took off his headphones slowly, his hands shaking. "There was a child in the cockpit," he whispered. The lead investigator frowned. "A child?" He nodded. "The captain's son." A long pause followed. No one wanted to believe it. It seemed impossible, absurd. The Soviet and Russian aviation systems prided themselves on discipline, hierarchy, procedure. The idea that a teenager had been at the controls during a fatal crash bordered on insanity. But the evidence was undeniable. The second black box, the flight data recorder, confirmed it. The controls had been manually deflected by small, inconsistent inputs during the final minutes. The autopilot's roll channel had been overridden. There was no sign of equipment failure. No sign of sabotage, no explosion, just human hands. Days later, when the news leaked to the press, the reaction was explosive. Headlines screamed across Moscow and beyond. "Child at controls of crashed Airbus. Captain's son caused Flight 593 disaster." The outrage was immediate. How could this happen? How could a professional pilot allow it? Aeroflot's reputation, already fragile in the post-Soviet chaos, was shattered overnight. The airline's management issued a statement calling the event an isolated tragedy. They grounded several A310s pending inspection. But the real questions were deeper, about human nature, about pride, about the culture that made such a thing possible. When the final report was released months later, it was both simple and devastating. The cause of the accident was unintentional manual disconnection of the autopilot by a person not authorized to operate the controls, followed by inappropriate pilot response. No mechanical failures, no other issues, just one decision, a father's gesture of love that spiraled into catastrophe. The families of the victims were told the truth privately before the report became public. Some wept, some screamed, others could only sit in silence, staring at the wall. The idea that a child, had unknowingly caused the deaths of 74 others was almost too much to bear. And for those who knew Captain Kudrinsky, the revelation was unbearable. He had been a model pilot, disciplined and kind, a man who believed in rules, a man who adored his children. One of his colleagues later said, "He didn't die because he was careless. He died because he was human." In the years that followed, Flight 593 became a case study in every aviation academy on Earth. It was the story of how technology and trust collided, how a modern autopilot system could be quietly overridden, how a moment of affection could turn fatal. It changed cockpit policy forever. After 1994, airlines around the world reinforced a simple rule: no unauthorized person, not even a family member, would ever sit at the controls again. Cockpit access was limited, monitored, and locked. And the tragedy of Aeroflot Flight 593 became a lesson carved into the DNA of aviation safety. But behind the regulations and reports, one truth remained. At 33,000 feet above Siberia, a father had wanted to make his son smile. And in that small, human moment, the sky had turned against them. When the investigation results became public, the world reacted with disbelief. Newspapers printed the story on their front pages, often with headlines that sounded more like tabloid shock than aviation reporting. A child in the cockpit. Pilot's son brings down Airbus. The flight that never should have happened. For many, it was easier to focus on the absurdity of it, to treat it like an unbelievable tale of negligence. But for those who lost someone on Flight 593, it was not absurd. It was agony. Families gathered in community halls across Russia, China, and Europe to hear official explanations. Aeroflot representatives arrived in suits, holding folders of paperwork and rehearsed apologies. They spoke of compensation, of regulations, of improvements. But no document, no money could fill the silence left behind. In the front rows sat parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, wives who had lost husbands. And somewhere in the crowd, behind dark sunglasses, sat the relatives of Captain Kudrinsky. For them, grief was complicated. They had lost a husband and a father, and at the same time, the world blamed him. In the weeks following the crash, journalists camped outside their apartment in Moscow. Questions shouted through the cold air. Why did he let the boy touch the controls? Was it true he invited both children into the cockpit? Did he realize what he was doing? The family stayed silent. Neighbors said that Yana, the captain's daughter, who had survived only because she was seated in the cabin, barely spoke for months. Inside their home, Igor's room remained untouched. His books, his model airplanes, the small wooden glider he had built with his father before the trip. The irony was unbearable. A boy who dreamed of flying had died in the act of flying, and his father, trying to share his passion, had taken him there. Meanwhile, within Aeroflot, a quiet panic grew. The airline was already struggling under the weight of a collapsing Soviet economy. Flight 593 had become a symbol of chaos, a story of how once mighty systems crumbled under human error and bureaucratic neglect. Executives held crisis meetings. Pilots were retrained on cockpit discipline. Autopilot functions were re-examined. In the following months, Aeroflot quietly phased out family members accompanying pilots on long-haul flights. Access to cockpits was restricted. It was the beginning of a new era, one where warmth and informality were replaced by procedure and protocol. The media storm, however, did not fade so easily. Talk shows debated the morality of the captain's actions. Some called him reckless. Others defended him. Letters poured into newspapers. He was only being a father. It was a tragic mistake, not a crime. They should not destroy his memory. But others were less forgiving. He killed my sister. I can't call that an accident. In the chaos of public opinion, one truth became clear. Nobody wanted to believe that something so simple, so human, could bring down a modern jet. People needed someone to blame, and Captain Kudrinsky became that symbol. Months turned into years. The crash site in Siberia was eventually cleaned and marked with a small memorial, a granite slab inscribed with 75 names. Pilots flying over the Kuznetsk Aletau still looked down sometimes, quietly, as if offering a moment of respect. Every year, relatives visited. They placed flowers, lit candles, whispered prayers into the wind. The snow covered everything, softening the wreckage, erasing the scars, but the memory remained sharp. In aviation circles, the lessons of Flight 593 began to spread far beyond Russia. At training academies in Europe, Asia, and America, instructors used it as an example, a turning point in understanding human factors. They showed the cockpit recordings in safety courses. The laughter, the confusion, the descent. Students watched in silence, realizing how quickly comfort could turn to chaos. The tragedy became a case study not just in technology, but in psychology, how a trusted system can lull humans into complacency, how love and pride can override caution, how 1 second of distraction can undo decades of progress. By the late 1990s, Aeroflot had changed. The airline modernized, partnered with Western carriers, improved training, and introduced new safety standards. But the name Flight 593 remained a scar in its history, a story pilots spoke of quietly, sometimes with anger, sometimes with pity. Some said, he broke the rules. Others said, he broke because of the rules. Because in truth, Captain Kudrinsky had not been a reckless man. He had been proud of his craft, proud of his family, and proud of his uniform. He had simply wanted to share a moment with his son, a glimpse into his world. And that single moment had rewritten his legacy. Years later, a retired pilot from the same division said in an interview, "People ask me if I'm angry at him. I'm not, because every pilot who's ever brought his kid to the cockpit understands. You want them to see the sky. You just never imagine it could end that way. In the cabin of that doomed flight were people from 7 countries. They had boarded a plane believing in safety, in technology, in trust. None of them could have imagined that fate would be decided not by storm or sabotage, but by the smallest, simplest gesture of father's pride. When news of the investigation reached Western media, it spread like wildfire. CNN opened with a headline that sounded almost unreal. Russian Airbus crash linked to child at controls. BBC followed. Investigators confirm unintentional cockpit interference led to Flight 593 disaster. In France, home of Airbus, the reaction was immediate. Aviation experts flooded television studios, trying to explain to an anxious public how such a thing could happen in a plane equipped with one of the most advanced autopilot systems in the world. The consensus was chillingly simple. The system had worked exactly as designed, but the humans had not understood it. In Toulouse, where Airbus engineers had built the A310, technicians replayed the flight data over and over. The graphs told a clear story. The autopilot's roll channel had disengaged when manual pressure was applied to the controls, but no alert had sounded to tell the pilots. It was a design choice meant for experienced hands, not for a child's curiosity. The plane did not fail. The system did not malfunction. It obeyed. That realization hit the aviation world like a shockwave. Because if a system could obey perfectly and still lead to disaster, what else might humans misunderstand? Within months, Airbus issued new training guidelines to all airlines operating the A310 and other aircraft in its family. Pilots were to receive expanded simulator instruction about partial autopilot disengagement. A new set of protocols emphasized cross-checking flight parameters every few minutes, even under full automation. The message was clear: trust your instruments, but never surrender awareness. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, also responded. In 1995, a new global standard for cockpit access was introduced. No unauthorized person, passenger, relative, or crew from another flight could occupy a control seat under any circumstances. Even on long, quiet routes, even with autopilot engaged, the cockpit was to remain professional space only. It was the end of an era. Old photographs from the 1970s and 80s, children smiling in pilot seats, celebrities posing with captains, now look like artifacts from another world. The warmth and openness of early aviation had given way to the cold precision of modern safety. Some pilots mourned that loss. Others welcomed it, but no one questioned its necessity. In Russia, the government's response was slower, quieter. The 1990s were years of chaos. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the economy was unraveling, and Aeroflot itself was splintering into dozens of smaller airlines. The tragedy of Flight 593 faded into the background noise of a nation struggling to survive. Yet within professional circles, it became legend. In pilot lounges, instructors whispered about it like a cautionary tale. Check your autopilot. Never let anyone touch the yoke. Remember 593. It was not just about guilt or punishment. It was about respect for the sky, for the machines, for the invisible line between control and chaos. Meanwhile, in other countries, regulators began asking deeper questions about the relationship between humans and automation. The 1990s were the dawn of the digital cockpit. Computers were taking over more tasks. Pilots were becoming managers rather than manual flyers. The disaster of Flight 593 exposed a growing tension. What happens when a human doesn't fully understand the system they rely on? Psychologists began studying automation complacency, the phenomenon where operators trust technology so deeply that they stop questioning it. Flight 593 was their proof. The cockpit crew had trusted the system so completely that they hadn't realized it was no longer flying the plane. In 1996, an ICAO report on human factors cited Flight 593 as a landmark case. It concluded, advanced automation does not eliminate error, it transforms it. From that phrase, a new philosophy of aviation training emerged. fly the airplane first. It became the golden rule taught in simulators around the world. No matter how advanced the aircraft, no matter how calm the sky, a pilot must always be ready to take control, to hand fly, to feel the airplane. In France, Airbus engineers added subtle software changes to future models. If one axis of autopilot disengaged, the system would now sound a clear warning. If control inputs were inconsistent or unusual, the cockpit would display a bold red message. Small changes, born from 75 lost lives. For the families, though, those changes came too late. They attended ceremonies, received formal apologies, saw plaques unveiled, but the empty seats at their tables remained. Some found peace in knowing their tragedy had made others safer. Others saw only the cruel irony of progress built on loss. One mother, interviewed years later, said, "They say no one will ever die that way again. But that doesn't bring back my son." Her voice broke. He was only 11. He wanted to see Hong Kong. He never even saw the sunrise. In the years that followed, Flight 593 slowly disappeared from headlines, replaced by new tragedies: TWA 800, Swissair 111, Concorde, MH370. But within the aviation community, its echo remained constant. Every pilot knew its story. Every simulator had its data. Every rulebook carried its legacy. It was not a story of failure, but of fragility, the thin line between routine and ruin, between a father's pride and a world's grief. And though the wreckage was cleared and the systems improved, one unanswerable question still lingered in every mind that studied the case. If you had been in his place, proud, loving, unaware, would you have done the same? For a while, it seemed as if the world had moved on. Headlines faded, lawsuits ended, reporters stopped calling. But grief doesn't follow news cycles. It lingers quietly, invisibly, in kitchens, in empty bedrooms, in the spaces where voices used to echo. In Moscow, Captain Kudrinsky's widow, Natalia, rarely left the apartment. Friends said she spoke softly, almost as if afraid to disturb something sacred. The world saw her husband as the man who brought down an airplane, but she still saw the man who once came home smelling of jet fuel, lifting his children in his arms after every flight. She kept a photo of him in uniform on the living room shelf, next to Igor's school picture and Yana's hand-drawn Father's Day card. Every morning, she lit a candle. Every night, she blew it out. Yana, the captain's daughter, was 13 when she lost everything: her father, her brother, her sense of safety. For months after the crash, she couldn't sleep without the sound of engines in her ears. Each passing plane made her flinch. But as she grew older, something inside her changed. She wanted to understand. Years later, as a young woman, she visited a flight museum in Zukovsky. Standing before the cockpit of an old Tu-154, she ran her fingers over the yoke, the same shape her brother had held. "I wanted to hate the sky," she told a journalist once. "But I couldn't. My father loved it too much." She never became a pilot, but she never stopped flying, either. Whenever she boarded a plane, she looked into the cockpit, just once, as if saying hello to him. For the families of the passengers, the years brought uneven healing. Some formed associations, writing letters to Aeroflot, to Airbus, to the Russian government. They fought for memorials, for recognition, for the simple dignity of being remembered. Others disappeared into silence, unwilling to reopen wounds. In small apartments from Vladivostok to Vienna, photo albums stayed closed, birthdays went unspoken, and the word Hong Kong carried the weight of a nightmare. In the pilot community, Flight 593 became a ghost story. Not a scary one, a sad one. Every pilot knew the technical details, the sequence of events, the fatal misunderstanding. But what they remembered most wasn't the mechanics. It was the humanity. It was the laughter on the recording before the fall. That laughter haunted them. "Every time I hear my kids laugh in the cockpit of my simulator," one instructor said, "I think of him, of the moment when everything was still okay." Aeroflot never fully erased Flight 593 from its records, but didn't commemorate it either. The official statement remained unchanged for decades, a short paragraph in an archive, written in the language of bureaucrats. Loss of control due to unauthorized manipulation of flight controls. No mention of names. No mention of love, or pride, or tragedy. But pilots remembered. They told the story to cadets, not to shame, but to teach. Don't get too comfortable, they said. The sky forgives nothing. In 2004, on the 10th anniversary of the crash, a small group gathered at the memorial in the mountains near Mezhdyurchinsk. Snow fell gently, muffling footsteps. Among the visitors were relatives, rescue workers, and a few pilots who had served with Captain Kudrinsky. They stood in silence, breath steaming in the cold. Someone placed a bouquet of red carnations on the granite slab. A priest murmured prayers. When he finished, one of the pilots, gray-haired now, stepped forward. He was a good man, he said quietly. He made one mistake, a human one. No one replied. They didn't need to. The words hung in the air, drifting like snowflakes, until the wind carried them away. By the 2010s, the story of Flight 593 had faded from public memory. Younger generations knew about Chernobyl, about MH370, about 9/11, but not about the quiet night over Siberia when a father tried to make his son smile. Yet in flight schools, the story lived on. On simulator screens, instructors recreated the scenario. Autopilot partially disengaged, slow bank, alarms, panic, loss of control. Students watched as data scrolled across their monitors, but behind every number, they saw people. And as they practiced recovery maneuvers, they always knew what was at stake. In one interview, a retired Airbus test pilot was asked if modern systems could ever prevent something like Flight 593. He nodded. Yes, technically, but machines don't feel guilt. People do. The lesson wasn't for the airplanes. It was for us. For Yana, the captain's daughter, life eventually found a rhythm again. She married, moved abroad, had children of her own. But every March 23rd, she still lit a candle. Not for tragedy, for memory. Her children once asked her why. Because, she said softly, your grandfather once touched the sky, and he never let go. Time passes, but the sky remembers. Every contrail that fades above the clouds, every flight number called over the radio, they carry echoes of those who came before. Flight 593 is one of those echoes, unseen but never gone. In the decades after the crash, aviation changed. The technology improved, the systems became smarter, and yet the story of that night remained embedded deep within the heart of every pilot's training. In classrooms from Paris to Los Angeles, instructors still spoke the name Aeroflot 593, not as a cautionary tale of incompetence, but as a lesson in humility. Before 1994, most pilots believed that automation made flying safer, cleaner, almost foolproof. Computers could react faster, calculate better, never tire. But Flight 593 revealed something no software engineer had anticipated. The human psychology, love, and trust could outsmart even the best machine. At a global aviation safety conference in Montreal, a behavioral scientist summarized it in one sentence. The most dangerous button in any cockpit is the one labeled autopilot. It wasn't sarcasm. What he meant was simple. When humans stop questioning machines, mistakes become invisible until it's too late. In 1998, the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations, IFALPA, released a landmark document, Human Factors in the Age of Automation. On its cover, a single photograph of an Airbus A310. Inside, a full chapter dedicated to Aeroflot Flight 593. It described the event not as a technical failure, but as an emotional collision between a father's affection and a machine's indifference. It called for a revolution in how pilots were trained, not only to operate, but to feel the system, to understand how quickly a human instinct could become a risk. By the 2000s, the crash had faded from public consciousness. Then came documentaries, British, American, and French, trying to piece together the night that stunned the world. Titles like Air Disasters, Kid in the Cockpit, and Disasters Uncovered, Flight 593, appeared on television. Millions watched reenactments of the descent, the flashing alarms, the final words. For the first time, viewers heard the laughter of Igor, the boy whose curiosity had changed history. That single moment when he said softly, "Can I try?" And his father replied, "Of course, son." Audiences wept. It wasn't a story about recklessness anymore. It was a story about humanity, how love and tragedy can share the same breath. Writers began exploring the event, too. In books about aviation safety, Flight 593 stood beside stories like Tenerife, United 232, Air France 447. Each was a reminder that perfection in flight is an illusion, and that safety is not a number, but a mindset. One American author wrote, "The saddest thing about Flight 593 is that it wasn't a disaster waiting to happen. It was a moment waiting to be understood." By the early 2000s, airlines worldwide had introduced new curricula under a simple philosophy: human first. Cockpit crews began training not just in emergency drills, but in communication, emotion management, and awareness. Simulators recreated Flight 593 as a teaching scenario, not to relive the horror, but to teach reaction under pressure. Instructors would pause the simulation at 33,000 feet, the moment when Igor first touched the controls, and ask, "What do you do now?" Some students immediately noticed the roll. Others missed it, trusting the screen that still read autopilot on. Then, when they finally realized the danger, it was too late, just like in 1994. Every time, the room fell silent. And when the session ended, the instructor would say quietly, "Now you understand. You don't fly the plane with your hands. You fly it with your mind." The crash of Flight 593 also became a symbol in art and conversation, a metaphor for how fragile control can be. In Russia, a small independent film titled Altitude loosely drew from the tragedy. It wasn't about blame or aviation. It was about parenthood, about a man who loved his child so deeply he didn't see the danger of letting go. The film's final line echoed the essence of Flight 593. Sometimes love takes us too close to the edge of the sky. In the West, aviation podcasts revisited the story during anniversaries. Pilots shared personal reflections, how they had shown their kids the cockpit, how they now locked the door. For many, it was no longer just a story about a Russian jet. It was about the thin line between affection and responsibility that every parent walks. In 2014, 2 decades after the crash, Airbus held a closed memorial at its headquarters in Toulouse. A small plaque was unveiled, simple, stainless steel, engraved with these words in French and English. To the passengers and crew of Flight 593, their loss shaped our vigilance. No cameras, no journalists, no speeches. Just a handful of engineers, pilots, and families standing in silence as the wind carried the sound of aircraft passing overhead. Flight 593 had become more than a disaster. It had become a mirror, reflecting what it means to be human in an age of machines. Technology had advanced, but emotion remained unchanged. Fathers still loved their children. People still trusted too deeply. And the sky, vast and merciless, still demanded respect. By the time the 21st century reached its second decade, the world had changed beyond recognition. Cockpits glowed with touch screens instead of dials. Artificial intelligence could calculate entire flight paths, and autopilot systems were capable of landing without a human hand. Yet among pilots, there was still a quiet superstition, a kind of inherited reverence. Never forget the story of Flight 593. It wasn't just about what happened in 1994. It was about what could happen any time a human forgot that technology, no matter how perfect, was still built on trust, and trust can break. For young cadets born long after the tragedy, the story felt almost mythical, like an old legend told by veterans to remind them of humility. A child took the controls, and the plane fell, they'd say, as if it were a fable about pride and fate. But the instructors, the ones who had lived through the 90s, spoke differently. To them, Flight 593 wasn't a myth, it was memory. They still remembered the shock of the headlines, the way the aviation world froze, the disbelief that such a thing could happen. They remembered where they were when they first heard the words, "a child in the cockpit." In flight simulators from Moscow to Madrid, the lesson continued. The young pilots sat in their seats, eyes focused on digital panels, hands steady on the controls. The instructors would start the simulation at 33,000 feet. The voice of the synthetic autopilot filled the room, calm and confident. Everything felt safe, until, without warning, the horizon began to tilt. Slowly, almost gently, the aircraft started to roll. The display still said autopilot on. For a few seconds, the students hesitated, trusting the machine. Then the alarms came alive, and it was too late. When the exercise ended, the silence felt heavy. One instructor always finished the same way. "That's how fast it happens. The sky doesn't forgive waiting." In that silence lived the soul of Flight 593. It was no longer about blame or guilt. It was about awareness, a kind of spiritual respect for the invisible balance between man and machine. For centuries, humans had looked up at the sky as a place of freedom. Now it was also a place of rules, systems, software. The pilot was no longer a conqueror of clouds, but a partner in a dialogue with algorithms. Flight 593 was proof of what happened when that dialogue broke down. Among older captains, there was still quiet empathy for Captain Kudrinsky. They understood the loneliness of the cockpit, the weight of responsibility, the temptation to share the beauty of it with your own child. Some said they would have done the same, not out of carelessness, but out of love. They saw in him not a villain, but a man who wanted to connect two worlds, family and sky. And they knew the pain of being remembered for a single moment that erased a lifetime of honor. The new generation of aviators, raised on automation, began to rediscover something old, the art of flying by hand. They practiced manual control in simulators, learning to feel the aircraft like living muscle instead of digital data. "The machine is smart," their trainers said, "but you are the conscience." Flight 593 had taught them that difference. Outside the world of aviation, few remembered the number anymore. To most people, it was just another forgotten tragedy buried beneath newer disasters and louder headlines. But in the quiet spaces of airports, in pilot lounges, in the first minutes before takeoff, its ghost still lived. Sometimes, as a captain looked over his instruments before a flight, he'd glance at the empty seat beside him and think of the boy. Just for a moment, a silent promise formed inside him to never let the sky take control of his judgment again. Technology kept evolving, but the questions remained the same. How much should we trust what we create? How far can we automate responsibility before we forget its cost? In the story of Flight 593, those questions had answers written not in theory, but in blood, metal, and snow. For the pilots who still told the story, it was not about fear, it was about memory. A reminder that love, even the purest kind, needs wisdom to survive at 30,000 feet. The systems may have changed, but the heart behind the yoke never would. Years passed, and the snow kept falling over the mountains of southern Siberia. The crash site, once blackened and raw, had become part of the landscape again. Trees grew where the wreckage had burned. Wind smoothed the scars in the earth. If you walked there now, you might never guess what had happened, unless you stopped, listened, and felt the silence. Because even silence remembers. In the spring, the valley filled with wildflowers. Locals sometimes hiked near the old memorial, a simple granite stone engraved with 75 names. Most didn't know their stories. They took photos, left coins, whispered a prayer if they believed in something. But the mountain remembered for them. Up there, time had folded itself around the past. The air felt cleaner, colder, but it carried ghosts. Every gust of wind sounded like the rush of engines. Every echo off the ridge felt like a whisper from the night of the fall. And maybe, somewhere beyond what eyes could see, the souls of the passengers still soared together, finally at peace, free from fear, free from gravity. Far away from that mountain, the world that had once been shocked by Flight 593 had long moved on. The news cycles were faster, the tragedies more frequent. Planes crashed, and headlines faded in days. But every once in a while, every March, someone somewhere would type those numbers into a search bar. And for a few quiet minutes, they would fall down the rabbit hole of history, reading, remembering, imagining. They'd see the black and white photo of the crew smiling in their uniforms, unaware that it would be the last one ever taken. They'd read the transcript of the cockpit recording, that small moment of laughter that still felt like sunlight before a storm. And they'd feel the weight of it all, how fragile life was, how short the distance between normal and disaster could be. In aviation museums, small plaques mentioned the flight in the context of safety innovation. Children walked by, pointing at airplane models, fascinated by the buttons and levers. Their parents read the signs, shook their heads, and moved on. Few lingered long enough to absorb the deeper truth, that behind every piece of progress there were lives that paid for it. In the quiet rooms of those museums, the reflection of light on the polished metal sometimes revealed something haunting, a faint, unintentional mirror image of the visitor themselves. It was as if the past whispered, "This could have been you." For the pilots who flew after, the lesson never aged. It became instinct. No one talked about it anymore. They didn't need to. It lived in the small rituals, the careful checklist, the second glance at an instrument, the habit of never taking anything for granted. They no longer needed to say, "Remember Flight 593. They remembered automatically, through action, through respect. Every time they reached cruise altitude, they knew what it cost to get there safely. And every time they descended through clouds toward the glow of a distant city, they carried those 75 souls with them. Not as ghosts, but as teachers. In Russia, the families grew older. Yana, the captain's daughter, visited the memorial only once more. She brought her children. She didn't tell them everything, just enough to make them understand that courage and tragedy often share the same space. She looked at the sky above the mountains, endless and silver, and for the first time in years, she smiled. "He loved this," she whispered. "He loved the sky." Her children stood beside her, holding small wildflowers. One of them looked up and asked, "Do you think he can see us?" Yana hesitated for a moment. Then she nodded. "Yes, he's right where he always wanted to be." Technology marched forward. Planes became safer, smarter, quieter. Pilots relied on data links, satellites, digital co-pilots that could predict storms and reroute paths in seconds. But the essence of Flight 593 still pulsed quietly in the foundations of aviation. The unseen rule behind every takeoff: respect the human element. Because no matter how advanced the machines became, no one could program empathy or love or the soft, dangerous pride of a father showing his son the sky. That part of flying would always belong to humans. In the grand scheme of history, Flight 593 was just a single story. 75 lives among billions. But stories are strange things. They fade from memory, yet they never truly vanish. They settle somewhere deeper, in the subconscious of a species that learns through pain. And one day, when another young pilot pauses before pressing a button, unsure for just a second, maybe that hesitation, that instinct to check again, will be the whisper of those 75 souls saving him from repeating their fate. At night, when planes cut through the dark sky over Siberia, their red lights blink in rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Somewhere among those stars, Flight 593 still flies, endlessly circling, forever part of the air it once trusted. Not as a tragedy, but as a memory. Not as a warning, but as a promise. A promise that the sky, though unforgiving, never forgets those who loved it. There's a saying among pilots: the sky remembers. It remembers every mistake, every triumph, every lesson learned the hardest way possible. For those who carry Flight 593 in their hearts, that saying isn't poetry, it's truth. 30 years have passed since that cold March night. The wreckage has rusted into the earth, the headlines have yellowed into history, and the world has flown millions of miles since. Yet when the topic arises, when an instructor mentions the Aeroflot A310 incident, there is still a pause in the room, a kind of reverent silence that no new technology can erase. Because Flight 593 was not just an accident. It was a mirror, one that reflected everything human about flight. Curiosity, love, overconfidence, fear, and the will to survive even when the odds are impossible. The tragedy forced the world to look inward. It asked a question that no manual could answer. Where does responsibility end when love begins? Captain Kudrinsky had followed every rule of professionalism for decades. But in that moment, in that dark cockpit surrounded by blinking lights and quiet air, he was not a captain. He was a father. And fathers want their children to see their world, to be proud, to understand. That small, simple human impulse, to share wonder, collided with the unforgiving physics of flight. The result was catastrophe, but the meaning went deeper than error or negligence. It was a reminder that every human system, no matter how complex, still depends on fragile hearts and imperfect decisions. In the years that followed, aviation engineers made airplanes more intelligent, pilots more disciplined, and systems more resistant to human interference. But the paradox remained. The smarter the machines became, the more vital it was to remember humanity. Airlines began speaking openly about human factor resilience. Safety manuals included entire sections on emotion, fatigue, distraction, and pride. Pilots were trained to monitor not just their instruments, but themselves, to notice when emotion crossed the invisible line between clarity and danger. In every classroom, the story of Flight 593 became a quiet chapter in that evolution. Not the loud kind, not the one shown in crash documentaries, but the kind that lingers, in the way a captain looks at a storm and decides to wait 5 more minutes before takeoff. That hesitation saves lives. That awareness is what the 75 souls of Flight 593 gave to the world. For Yana, the daughter who grew up with the silence of loss, the years softened what once felt unbearable. In her adulthood, she stopped defining her father by the crash. She began to speak of him as she remembered him. Not the man at the controls that night, but the man who taught her to read the stars through the window of their apartment, who told her that the world always looks smaller when you're above the clouds. In an interview decades later, she said something that captured what the world had taken so long to understand. He didn't fail as a pilot. He failed as a human being trying to love too much in a place where love doesn't belong, in a machine. Her words carried no bitterness, only peace. Each anniversary, a small group still gathers in Mezhirchinsk. They bring flowers, photographs, and silence. Sometimes a light snow falls. Sometimes the wind howls across the mountains. Every year, someone reads the list of names aloud. The voices tremble, then fade. Among those 75 names is one that no longer sounds like blame: Igor Kudrinsky. For years, people could not say it without anger. But now, time has made room for forgiveness. He was 15, a boy curious about his father's world, a boy who trusted too much. He did not mean to end lives. He only meant to feel close to his father. That is the tragedy of innocence. It never knows its own danger. Somewhere high above, planes cross the same sky every day, their lights blinking against the darkness. Inside those cockpits, fathers still think of their children waiting for them at home. Some of them whisper a silent promise before takeoff. Not today, not again. And maybe in some invisible way, the spirit of Flight 593 listens, not as a ghost, but as a guardian. Every near miss avoided, every quick correction made in time, feels like their unseen hand guiding from the shadows. The sky, after all, is full of memory. In one of the final reports written after the disaster, an investigator included a single line at the end, a note not for engineers, but for humans. Technology will save us from many things, but only humility will save us from ourselves. That sentence became a quiet truth among pilots, a kind of creed. When planes climb through the night, piercing the clouds and entering the still black air above, passengers look out the windows and see nothing but stars. They don't know the history written in that sky, the stories of triumph and loss that made their journey safe. But the pilots do. They carry that history in their hands, in every decision, in every cautious glance at the horizon. And among the countless lessons written in the clouds, one remains eternal. That love without awareness is as dangerous as flying without instruments. Flight 593 was not the end of something. It was the beginning of understanding. The understanding that the sky is not ours to control, it is only ours to respect. And maybe that is what Captain Kudrinsky tried to teach his son all along. He just didn't have enough time. The mountains of southern Siberia sleep beneath a quiet blanket of snow. In winter, the wind moves gently through the pines, carrying a faint echo that only those who listen carefully can hear. The distant hum of engines, a vibration born not of sound, but of memory. To the world, it's just wind. But for those who know the story, it's something else, a whisper from the past, a voice of the sky saying, "I remember." The memorial stands alone now, a small stone among giants of ice and rock. Names carved into its surface have faded slightly, the letters softened by decades of storms. Yet every line still carries weight. 75 people, 75 stories, frozen in time. Hikers pass by sometimes, pausing to read a few of the names aloud, not realizing that their breath, their words, are carrying those souls forward, keeping them alive a little longer. Above them, thousands of flights cross the same sky every day, silver birds gliding through the air, following invisible highways of wind. Pilots check instruments, talk to air traffic control, and sip coffee as lights flicker across the dashboard. Everything feels routine, but inside that routine is a kind of sacredness, a discipline carved from tragedy. Every time an autopilot is disengaged correctly, every time a checklist is double-checked, every time a captain glances once more at the horizon, just to be sure, that's Flight 593 living again, quietly, invisibly, teaching without words. The lesson is no longer about death. It's about presence, awareness, respect. Yana sometimes dreams about the night her father's plane disappeared. In her dreams, she sees him standing in a doorway of light. Not the cockpit door, but something brighter, endless. He smiles, and behind him is Igor, still 15, still curious, still holding a small model airplane. The two of them wave. There is no fear in their eyes, no guilt, only peace. She wakes up crying, but not from sadness, from gratitude, because for years she thought the sky had taken them. Now she knows the sky simply keeps them. In Moscow, inside the Aeroflot Academy, a new generation of cadets sits through their first class on flight ethics. The instructor, a quiet man with gray at his temples, begins not with rules or procedures, but with a story. He tells them about a night in 1994, about laughter that turned into alarms, about how one touch changed everything. The room stays silent as he speaks, not because they fear the past, but because they recognize themselves in it. That fragile mix of ambition, pride, and humanity that defines every person who's ever dreamed of flying. When he finishes, he says only, "You are here because of them. Never forget that." And the cadets nod. Some look at each other, realizing that the cockpit they dream of isn't just a place of control. It's a place of responsibility. In Toulouse, the engineers who now design the most advanced aircraft in the world work in silence. Their offices overlook a runway that never sleeps, planes taking off and landing in rhythm with the heartbeat of progress. Somewhere on their computers are the old files, the reports, the graphs from 1994. They rarely open them, but when they do, they pause, because even code and metal have memory. One of them keeps a small piece of wreckage from Flight 593 on his desk, a fragment of aluminum polished to silver, its edges smooth like riverstone. He says it reminds him that perfection isn't real, only responsibility is. At night, from above the earth, the sky looks calm, blue turning to black, clouds glowing faintly from the city lights below. The pilots cruising through that darkness often think about the strange intimacy of flight, how they move through air invisible yet trusted, between worlds of life and death, always balanced on precision. And maybe in some small way, that thought is what keeps them safe. There's an old Russian proverb that says, "The sky judges no one, but forgets nothing." It fits Flight 593 perfectly, because in the end, no one can hate the sky. It gives us freedom, wonder, beauty, but demands humility. Captain Kudrinsky learned that lesson too late, but he taught it to generations who would never know his name. Now, his story lives where all stories of flight belong, not on the ground, but up there between clouds and eternity. In one quiet moment before dawn, a lone jet passes over the same Siberian valley where Flight 593 fell. Inside the cockpit, two pilots exchange a few words, check their headings, and glance briefly at the stars above the horizon. Neither speaks of the past, but both feel it. A faint shiver passes through the air, not turbulence, but memory. And as the plane continues eastward into the rising sun, the valley below fades into shadow. The engines hum, the instruments glow, and for a heartbeat, the sky feels heavier, fuller, as if carrying 75 names within it. Then a light breaks through. The sky exhales, and flight continues. There's a point above the clouds where the world disappears. No sound, no wind, no horizon, only a vast, weightless silence. Every pilot knows that place. It's where the earth feels far away and the sky feels endless. Some say it's where the living and the lost share the same air. If that's true, then Flight 593 never really left. It simply crossed into that silence, where time no longer matters and memory has no weight. At dawn, the first rays of light touch the mountains near Mezhdyurchinsk. Frost glitters on the trees, the river flows beneath thin ice, and somewhere among the pines stands the small granite stone with 75 names. The snow covers most of it now, but when the sun rises, the letters glow faintly, as if the names themselves breathe. A bird passes overhead, its wings slicing through the frozen air, rising higher, higher, until it vanishes into the brightening sky. The valley returns to quiet, but for a second, the silence feels alive. High above, thousands of flights trace invisible paths across the planet. One of them, perhaps by coincidence, perhaps by fate, passes directly over that valley. In the cockpit, the captain sits beside his first officer, scanning the instruments, watching the sky. The autopilot hums softly. The world below is hidden beneath clouds. The captain takes a deep breath. He's been flying for 20 years. He's heard the story of Flight 593 100 times, in training, in safety briefings, in conversations that start with a sigh and end in silence. He doesn't think of it often anymore. But tonight, for no reason he can name, it comes back to him: the father, the son, the laughter, the fall. He looks out at the stars beyond the windshield, bright, cold, eternal. Then he reaches forward and gently places his hand on the yoke, just to feel it, to remember that even surrounded by technology, control is still human. The gesture is small, almost invisible, but it's enough. In that moment, the line between past and present blurs. Somewhere in the deep of the night sky, the spirit of another cockpit awakens. The echo of a father's voice, the faint laughter of a boy, the hum of engines long gone. They're not trapped anymore. They're flying. Not falling, not burning, not afraid, just flying. Through air and light and memory. Through decades of progress and regret. Through every pilot who remembers them without knowing. They fly quietly, endlessly, guiding from the unseen. Below, in the small town near the Kuznetsk Alatow, Yana wakes early. She pours coffee, stands by the window, and watches a plane move slowly across the sky, a tiny silver speck glowing in the morning sun. She doesn't know which flight it is or where it's going, but she knows instinctively that every plane that crosses that horizon is part of her father's story now. She smiles, not the smile of forgetting, the smile of acceptance. When people talk about Flight 593 today, they speak differently. It's no longer a story about blame or tragedy. It's about connection, between man and machine, between risk and love, between sky and soul. It reminds us that even in an age of algorithms and autopilot, the heart still matters most. Because that's what Flight 593 truly was. Not a failure of systems, but a moment of being human in a world that demanded perfection. And maybe that's what makes it timeless. The sky above Siberia is calm again. The stars fade one by one as the morning grows brighter. Somewhere far to the west, another flight takes off. Engines roar, wheels lift, and a new story begins. Inside that aircraft, a child presses her face to the window, staring out at the clouds, wide-eyed with wonder. Her mother smiles softly. One day, she says, "You'll understand why people love the sky." The child nods, still watching, still dreaming. Up there, beyond what eyes can see, where sound dissolves and time stands still, Flight 593 continues its eternal journey. Not toward any destination, but as part of the air itself. A father and his son, 73 others beside them. Together, weightless, remembered. And as long as planes fly, as long as humans reach upward, their story will stay written where it began. Not in reports, not in metal, but in the sky. Because the sky keeps them. Always.